What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to the new garage. This is more space than we have ever had to work on this project. Obviously, we've still got a bunch of stuff laying around from the move, but in this video, I'm going to be pulling this FA20 out of the BRZ to make way for the new K24 A2 to go in. Let's jump into it. All right, so the first thing on our checklist to get this engine pulled out is to drain the coolant and drain the oil. That way, whenever we start disconnecting any of the lines from this engine, whether that be the coolant hoses, the oil feed to the turbo, any of that kind of stuff is not gonna just start draining all over the floor, and we can kind of try and contain it a little bit. I'm sure there's gonna be remnants that we're gonna have to deal with along the way, but the majority of the coolant and the oil has already been pulled out. So I believe the first steps, I'm really just gonna kind of start pulling stuff off. I've got a bunch of little Ziploc bags that I'm gonna start, putting all of these nuts and bolts into as I'm taking all of this stuff apart. But realistically, my plan is to try and disassemble the turbo kit as completely as possible, because I'm most likely gonna be trying to sell the turbo kit for, whoever in the area is looking for one. And after that, it's like, disconnecting the wiring harness or the AC lines. Yeah, once everything in the engine bay is disconnected, it's pretty much get underneath, unbolt the transmission, unbolt the engine mounts, and then get this thing pulled out. So let's jump into it. Old intercooler out of the way. Okay, so up to this point, I basically just removed the intercooler piping. I've got it all stacked up here on my shelves. Now, we've got the turbo and we have the down pipe with the O2 sensor, which that'll be easy enough to disconnect. But then we've got the connection from the turbo to the header, the turbo, manifold essentially, which comes up from the bottom up to here and bolts onto there. And then, obviously this little air intake, which is technically part of the intake piping. So I'll get that disconnected. That's not really a big deal. But then we've got all these little extra kind of boost lines and little connectors. This goes to the, I believe that's the internal wastegate. Or is that another blow-off valve? Because that's technically on the compressor. I don't know. This is a really cheap turbo kit, hence why this engine probably blew up. Cheap turbo kit, cheap tune, not a recipe for success necessarily. So I think what I'm gonna have to try to do is get this radiator shroud. I need to get the fans out of the way just to free up some space. It may also be a good idea just to go ahead and disconnect the radiator altogether and then pull this guy off, so we have just the entire front of the engine bay completely clear and open, so we can just pull the engine more or less straight out instead of having to worry about having to go out and up, because if I just pull all this out of the way, this thing can just come straight out. So I'm gonna keep chugging away at it. I'm not really worried about we've got your stock ECU box here with your big, main wiring harness. I'm not really concerned about disconnecting any of that at the moment. I'm just trying to get this whole turbo kit out of the way. So I'm probably gonna end up underneath pretty soon here, so. All right, well, I should have removed this much sooner, because now I can get all the way up in here instead of having to be restricted to be able to get in. So that's a pretty big win and wasn't all that difficult. I don't know why I hesitated to take that off. Anyway, so I have gotten this loose, and I believe this is called the radiator brace or the radiator support. Basically, it's the top centerpiece that goes across in between both of the headlights. I'm gonna get this thing disconnected, and I think I've got to remove this one little clip so that this whole cable underneath will loosen up. And then after that, we can remove this piece. Then I can work on taking my coolant piping off. We can take the overflow bottle off. We can get the fan shroud out. We can get the radiator out of the way, which also includes the AC heat exchanger as well. And once we do that, this whole front section will be clear, so then we can get everything from the front disconnected. We can get the engine out. All right, so I've been screwing around with this for a while. I disconnected the coolant hose that goes from the engine block to the radiator. Once you get these clips disconnected from the fan, you're going to be looking for two little clips. I don't know if you can see where my middle finger is showing you. Yeah, so these two little clips. Basically, you're gonna wanna pinch in on these two clips, and that will separate the fan shroud from the body of the radiator. You also have two over here on this side as well. So again, just sort of pinch in on those two, it'll press through, and then I should be able to pull the fan shroud off. This is why these little front mount turbo setups, as cool as they are, because the undermount turbo setups, like, you don't get to see the turbo, so it's not like cool or impressive. These top mount turbo setups like this are just the worst. Take my word for it. It took me pretty much all night to get to the point that I currently am. This is where we are. I was finally able to get the radiator fan shroud, the radiator, and the AC heat exchanger pulled out so that I could get the turbocharger, which was sitting right here in the front, pushed down underneath. I worked until about 11 o'clock last night just trying to get that done. And so what I ended up having to do was get underneath the car, unbolt the turbo manifold from the bottom of the engine, just so that the turbo would kind of move position a little bit. I used my floor jack to get underneath the exhaust manifold and sort of support it from the bottom, but that allowed me to get it out of the way just far enough to where I could pull out my radiator fan shroud. Once I had the fan shroud out, I was able to undo the 2 bolts here and the 2 bolts here that hold in the top radiator support. Once those were out of the way, I could pull the radiator out. Then I disconnected the 2 front AC lines for the AC heat exchanger at the front here, which I don't necessarily recommend you guys doing if you can help it, because Freon is somewhat carcinogenic, meaning that it can cause cancer if you're exposed to it for a long enough period of time. So if you can afford it or manage it or swing it, take your car to an AC shop and have them drain the AC of all of the, compressible Freon gas. Because when I loosened these, to turn my fan on super high with the garage door open, and system empty out, and to push all of that gas out of here, which is not necessarily good for the environment, but I have no way of getting this to an AC shop for them to do it. So this is kind of my only option. So moving on. So once I had everything at the front here out of the way, having to do with the radiator setup, I then found that as I was trying to just drop the turbo down through the bottom, that the downpipe, which comes off of the turbocharger, as this was dropping, this guy was hitting this front cross member. So there was just no way that this thing was going to be able to drop out of there smoothly and easily. But the top 3 bolts that you guys can see on this were easy enough to access, but the two that are on the bottom side were damn near impossible to remove. I somehow, by the grace of the universe, managed to get those other two bolts off so I could remove the downpipe, and then I could drop the turbo manifold with the turbo down through the gap in the front of the engine here. So yeah, once I had the downpipe off, I could drop that whole turbo manifold and the turbo still attached down through the bottom, and then finally remove it. To recap everything that we have removed so far, we have the turbo manifold with the hot side of the turbo, the compressor side of the turbo, the downpipe, the kind of connector section from the downpipe to the overpipe. This had those two connections for the O2 sensors, which is like a 19 or a 21 millimeter bolt that you just get those unscrewed. We have of course, all of the intake piping off. We have the radiator fans, the radiator itself, the AC heat exchanger, and the radiator overflow bottle there. Now, what I need to focus on at this point is actually the main purpose of this whole thing, this whole video, is to get this bad boy out of here. And so what I'm gonna need to focus on is basically just disconnecting everything that I can find that attaches to this engine. So the alternator wiring, anything connecting to the main ECU harness, all of these wiring ports here, vacuum lines, the heater core hoses that supply heat to the cabin, the fuel lines, the AC compressor lines, extra vacuum lines for the brake booster, anything that potentially connects the transmission to the engine or anything along those lines. So I'm basically just going to be going through, disconnecting as many things as I can find. And I don't know about these fuel lines. I know fuel lines kind of have like a, you know, specialized tool set that you can use to pull fuel lines off without getting fuel everywhere, but I may just end up with paper towels under there and yanking these off somehow, just disconnecting the bolts or something along those lines. So let's jump into that, and then after that we're gonna have to end up under the car so that we can disconnect the drive shaft from the transmission, disconnect the transmission from the shifter, which goes to the interior, and then at that point we'll just loosen up the engine mounts and this baby should be ready to pop out. So back here we have one of the main chassis harness connectors, but we have the main ECU for the stock engine here and the big, you know, beefy connectors on the sides that feed everything, all that information to the engine. This is the slave cylinder for the clutch inside the manual transmission. So this will get disconnected. That looks like maybe a 14 mil, and that feeds to the master cylinder. So you have your master cylinder and your slave cylinder. I've got, I believe, my map sensor maybe for the turbo kit that feeds to this little line that I've marked with green tape. This is also part of the turbo kit, so I'm kind of trying to keep those labeled so that I know what needs to go with the turbo kit whenever I sell it. Let's see, I've got these two little connectors down here in the middle that are on the transmission. I think it's probably like flywheel speed and other such for the tachometer. We got the heater core lines removed, which are these two guys. I just have them pulled up and folded out of the way. All it was just a couple of little hose clamps. Pinch the hose clamp, pull them back, yank, turn, twist, and pull to get the cord off of the heater core, and they are pretty springy, so they don't really want to stay out of the freaking way. I disconnected the cable of my, I swear you're going in the trash. I got the cable for my master cylinder to my slave cylinder right here disconnected, just this little banjo bolt, so that's out of the way. Now that all this is cleared out, I'll make getting these two little Oh, and I fooling around with those dang hose clips, I jammed the crap out of my thumb too. So now my left thumb hurts pretty bad. So let's see if I can get these clips out. There's one. And hey, come on. Press, squeeze, pull. There we go. All right. It's disconnected, but this is still but this whole wiring segment is, yeah, this is just hurting. This whole wiring segment here is still connected by what appears to be a teeny little ground wire right here. So we'll pull that off. Now there is one thing that I do know is quite important that I wanted to point out is on either side, and I'll see if I can show you from underneath. See this little cable right here, this little kind of fabric dongle? This is a ground cable that connects the block of the engine to the chassis of the car. There's one on this side and there's one on the other side. It's really easy to forget about these and then go lifting the engine and just tear those right off. So disconnect those. I think it's just one little 10mm bolt on each side. I don't think I need to remove any more of this exhaust necessarily. I think we're good on that front. That's the overpipe. I may remove that just for convenience. The only thing I think we really have left on top are these fuel lines, which I'm still figuring out. I haven't really looked up, like, you know, what I'm gonna do with these. But they are definitely still full of really old fuel that needs to be drained. So at some point, these are gonna have to come off. So at this point, I think I'm mostly done up top, except for the fuel lines and a couple other little bolts that I'm gonna get right now really quick. After that, we're gonna go ahead and jump down underneath, see if I can start unbolting the drive shaft, unbolt the transmission and the shifter, and then I'll have to get the fuel lines figured out. And then at that point, we'll be ready to unbolt the motor mounts and start pulling up on this thing and see what we inevitably have missed that's likely still connected. So now we are under the car, trying to give you guys a decent idea of where we're at. I have removed, see if I can show you this. So we've got the back of the car where you can see the differential, and this is the resonator that heads out the back of the catback side. So I've disconnected this right here next to this sort of hanger bearing for the two-piece drive shaft. So I've disconnected the catback here, and I've also removed the overpipe, which would normally be, you know, kind of crossing over this front subframe. So that's also out of the way. So now, in order to get the drive shaft out, I'm gonna remove the drive shaft before I try and loosen up the transmission at all. So in order to get the drive shaft out of here, you've got these two bolts right here on this sort of carrier bearing, if you will. So essentially what you're going to do is remove these two 14mm bolts, the one right here that's obvious to see and the one that's slightly down there. And then you're going to want to disconnect the four 14mm bolts that hold the drive shaft to the differential. And one of the things that's going to be helpful in order to be able to turn this drive shaft while you work on it is that the car is in neutral and the handbrake is off. And while that's all nice and good to talk about, I have to drain the transmission fluid before I can do that, because the drive shaft is a slip type. So it slips in, it has like a splined shaft that goes into the backside of the transmission. And so it doesn't just, you know, bolt in with 3 or 4 bolts. So whenever you go to pull the back out the drive shaft from the transmission, if you haven't drained the fluid already, it's gonna come out whenever you pull the drive shaft out. So I'm gonna get the transmission drained, and then we're gonna get the drive shaft pulled out. And at that point, it's like unbolt the transmission and unbolt the engine mounts from the front subframe. And at that point, we can start lifting. All right, so to show you guys what we had to do, we have this hole up here at the top, right here that I'm shining my light at. So we had to, that is the fill hole. So it's kind of like when you're draining the oil out of your engine, you want to unscrew the oil filler cap so that you're not creating any sort of like vacuum suction and your drain sort of burbles out. So once we took the fill cap bolt out, we took the drain bolt out, and oh geez. Yeah, that's a problem. It's real hot in this garage, so I've got my fan running, so it's just kind of this transmission fluid's flailing all over the place, and it's probably on the camera now too. So let me get this cleaned up, and then we'll address the drive shaft after this. God. All right, that's where I'm gonna call it a night. We made pretty decent progress today. We got almost everything from the engine bay disconnected, a bunch of wires, a couple of sensors for some gauges that I'm gonna need to retain, so that's good to know those. Heater hoses, AC hoses, fuel lines. I need to get that sorted out, but I mean, you can get like fuel line tool kits from AutoZone for real cheap. And yeah, pretty much once that's done, it's unbolt the transmission, unbolt the engine mounts on the front of the subframe, and start cranking this thing out of there. And inevitably, I'll probably find a couple of things that still need to be disconnected. So that's where I'm gonna end it for tonight. It is about 10:30 on a work night, and I'm an old man, so we will see you guys tomorrow. All right, day 3, and we are back with some tools for the fuel lines. All right, so what we have here is the AC fuel line disconnect set. You can get these in a variety of form factors. Some of them only come with just the head pieces without all these little handles, but this is the variety that I happen to like. And so you have, various different sizes for both fuel lines as well as AC lines. So let me pop these open and show you how we're gonna end up using these. So what we're gonna be doing with these bad boys is we're going to be using these to disconnect the main fuel supply from these pieces that actually feed to the fuel rails. And so these green little clips here that you can see are what we're going to be aiming to disconnect with these tools, or really one of these tools. So effectively what you're looking at is a little kind of 2-piece connector, but what you want to be able to do is to sink this around whatever line it is, whether it's fuel or AC, and then using the tip, the sort of head piece here, push into this green plastic connector, and then that will allow you, that'll release the spring pins underneath and allow you to disconnect these lines. Now, I'm not exactly sure which of these I need. I'm gonna have to figure that out. Here is the tool that I'm going to be using. It is the 8mm/5/16 one of these little fuel line disconnector tools. So what I'm going to be doing is basically, the way that these lines are set up, they have this extra little ridge. I'll see if I can zoom this in for you. See how they have this extra little ridge right here? That actually makes it kind of difficult. Like, you can get it around the piece of the tubing here, which is good, but you can't get to what you need to work on. And so if you try to expand this and jump over that, then you can't get the tool underneath the inside of the clip like you need. So what I'm actually going to try to do is sort of pry these apart and only really use one half, and see if I can get the top half to sort of squeeze in underneath. Let's see if we can get this to go here. Ow. There we go. See how that's flat all the way down in there? Now this should, there we go. Just needed a little persuading. Pretty close. Let's see if that'll come out now. Yes. Nicely done. Fantastic. All right, fuel lines are now disconnected. Let's hop under the car, get to the transmission. I have the back half of the exhaust here. We have got our shifter connection right here underneath this little boot. So what we're gonna wanna do is remove this little cotter pin. My hand's in the way of the light. This little cotter pin right here. Once we disconnect that, we can pull the shifter linkage sideways and disconnect the linkage that goes to the transmission from the underside of the shifter, which is in the interior of a car. This is going to prevent us from having to remove the entire shifter right this second. We will do that at some point, but I just don't want to have to tear apart the interior just to get the transmission out. So once we pull the cotter pin, we can pull the linkage out. From there, we are going to work on the trans. Realistically, you could just take the entire carriage transmission bracket out with these 4 14mm bolts, but then you're going to be dragging this whole piece with you as you pull it out. So what I think I'm going to do is disconnect the 2 bolts here and the 2 identical bolts on the other side, and then after that, I will remove these 4 bolts for the main bracket. That way, whenever I go to pull the trans, this will not be connected. But I'm gonna do these first, and then from that, we're gonna get up front to the subframe for the engine motor mounts. And then, actually, before we undo the motor mounts, I'm gonna hook up my crane, and then we'll go from there. This is how cheap this turbo kit was. The bolt that I'm trying to use to connect my hanger, my leveler, so this is an extra bracket. This is not stock. This bracket came with the turbo kit because this is where the turbo mounts to it to relieve some of the pressure off the turbo manifold. Almost all of these bolts were the bolt is a 13 mil and the head that screws onto the bolt, or the nut that screws onto the bolt, is 12 mil. This is just hardware store, home decor hardware. This is trash, my man. All right, so as you can see, we have our first mounting point right here, which is probably not going to be super standard for most people doing the swap. If you don't already have a turbo kit that came with some kind of bracket, this is just the most convenient thing for me. It's right on the front to the engine. It's relatively close to the center, so I'm going with that there. You can always, if you want to, connect another one over here to your tensioner or idler pulleys or somewhere on the block, but I reckon I should be just fine with this one. Taking a look down in here, you can see that on the back of the engine, comes stock, there is this little bracket right here that has this big open hole. It's almost as if this is intended for use with lifting this engine, which is most likely the case because the hole that's in this little bracket right here doesn't do anything. It's not normally connected to anything under stock conditions. But I've got my other lift point mounted right to that because that seems nice and solid. So at this point, the only thing left to do really is to pull my crane up here, get some tension on this so that it's kind of holding the weight of the engine, go underneath, fully unbolt the transmission. I basically just got everything loose down there. Fully unbolt the engine mounts to the front subframe, and then at that point, it's all just gonna be, the transmission will start to float at the back end, because once you remove the support from the backside, there's nothing really holding it except for the fact that it's mounted to the back of the engine. And then once you remove the bolts from underneath the engine in the subframe, the engine is pretty much just gonna be ready to lift up at that point. So let's go ahead and get underneath, get everything unbolted, and then we'll come back up here, see if we can't give it a yank. All right, so now that we're in the interior, because I have to disconnect the shifter from the transmission in order to be able to get the trans out, I've basically just pulled off a couple of the simple parts like the e-brake shroud cover, the little leather cover. Basically just pulls straight up and then slips over top of this. The shifter surround, which is this guy, again, is just some plastic clips that pull up and comes up over top of this. I took off my shift knob, and then once you get underneath, there's actually this piece of foam with some kind of like a rubber plasticky kind of a gasket that's being held in with two plastic clips. You just pull those up, straight up, and then you can wiggle this guy free. So now I'm trying to see if I can get to, there are 4 bolts here. You can see 1 down there, 2, 3 up at the front, and then 4 up here, which you kind of can't see. So I'm gonna try and get those without having to remove all of this, the whole center console. It's just, I'm really trying to get done with this, and I really don't want to have to take the time to remove these plastic bits. So I'm gonna try and just get to the nuts and bolts. Once I get those 4 bolts off, this whole thing will come up, and then I can disconnect the shifter via the 1, 2, 3, 4 bolts connected underneath here. Once that's done, the shifter will come out and the trans will be completely free. So let's see if we can do that. Well, I have gotten to the point where I've realized that all of this most likely is going to have to come out. After I was finally able to get those 4 12mm bolts undone from this, there's these other 2 Phillips head screws that attach to this same piece of metal that goes around here, which is basically like the base plate for the shifter. But there's no way to get that out of here, or really there's no way to get access to underneath this, which is 100% the only thing I really need at this point, is to get under this boot. I mean, I could cut the boot, right? No, I might be able to sell it with the transmission. I'm not going to cut the boot, so, well, I don't know. I'm most likely going to have to take all of this whole center console out, which isn't going to be the end of the world. It's just a couple of clips to get these little pieces off, and then you got to undo the bolts for this guy, undo the connections, and then pull out this whole center piece, which is, again, just a bunch of clips. Just another thing getting in the way. I am so ready for this engine to be out of here, you guys don't even know. The whole reason I'm doing this is to get to these 4 bolts right here. 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the other corner. This whole piece here, this whole kind of hump piece, is connected to the back of the transmission, and I'm not able to disconnect it underneath the car while trying to pull this out. So I can get these 4 bolts undone, and we should be able to get this friggin' engine out, gone. Now the last tiny little part on the transmission is this whole piece that I've been trying to disconnect. There's this one tiny little rod here that goes into this rubber bushing of types. I don't think I need to remove the rubber bushing. I might just be able to pull this straight out of that bushing, but it's also only 2 bolts underneath the car that I might just go ahead and undo, so. All right, so as you can see, this was the final bracket, or not even really bracket, that was the bushing that the end of this whole bracket was tied into. So what I did was unbolt the bushing on both sides. Once this came loose, I just removed the bushing and bolted it back in so that I can't lose it. Now, if you may be able to tell, this whole transmission, this whole thing is now one big wobbly mess. Now I'm gonna go up front to where the engine subframe mounts are, get those completely unbolted since I already have the engine, since I already have some tension on the engine. I shouldn't really have to worry about this whole thing falling at all. Get the 2 front motor mounts undone, and we'll yank her out. The bolt that connects the motor mount to the front subframe is sticking somewhere. So I just dropped it back down. It is now resting on the front subframe again. Because yeah, I can see as I'm lifting it, it's kind of tilting up this way. So this side of the engine, and obviously like my engine lift points are kind of on that half of the engine as well. But it's really lifting up from this passenger side of the engine and not really so much over here. Yeah, like I can see it wants to move. So I'm gonna move the anchor point on the front over to a different spot on the block right underneath or close to the AC compressor. And hopefully that'll kind of balance the weight distribution as I'm lifting. That way I won't have to worry about this right side, this driver side, not wanting to come free. Oh, 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 moving in the right direction. Hey, engine is free. Slowly. Doesn't smack too many things on the way out here. Oh, that's coolant. Surprise. Oh my God. And with that, the engine is out of the car. Finally, we've got transmission fluid falling all over the front subframe. We've got coolant dumping out from hoses that I thought I had emptied or drained. I mean, I could have removed this earlier, but you know, whatever, it'll work. Woohoo! All right, guys, that is gonna wrap it up. We have finished pulling the engine from the Subaru BRZ. The K24 is not quite ready to be dropped in yet. We've still got to figure out some of our turbo management. I've still got a new crankshaft pulley. I've got an ATI super damper on the way. That should be a relatively quick install, bolt on, bolt off type deal. And then we also have to get the valve cover, you know, gasket, get all the spark plugs in, get the fuel injectors attached to the fuel rail, get the fuel rail onto the intake manifold, get the spark plugs in, just all of those kinds of, you know, finishing, buttoning up the engine, gaskets, sealants, all that kind of stuff. So over the next couple of weeks, we're gonna be wrapping that engine up, getting ready to test fit it into the engine bay. Now, there are gonna be a couple of things that I'm gonna have to do to the engine bay in terms of sort of massaging to make sure that it fits, because these engine mounts have this engine pushed as far back as possible for the sake of center of gravity in terms of your front rear weight balance. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, then make sure you give it a big thumbs up down below, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out and you can keep up to date with the build. And until next time, build your dreams.